800 messages in 48 hours without a single error. That's what one Navajo Code Talker accomplished during the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945, transmitting tactical intelligence faster and more accurately than any encryption machine could manage, while Japanese cryptographers listened helplessly to communications they couldn't understand, despite desperate attempts to break the code. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer at Iwo Jima, stated after the battle that were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken the island, crediting Code Talker communications with enabling the coordination and speed that overwhelmed Japanese defenses through information superiority that enemies couldn't counter. This is the story of how the Navajo language became America's most effective encryption system in World War II, how 421 Navajo Marines created an unbreakable code that Japanese intelligence never deciphered despite capturing equipment and interrogating prisoners, and how their contribution remained classified for decades while the men who'd served couldn't tell their own families what they'd done during the war. The Navajo language was perfect for military encryption because it was complex, unwritten, and known by virtually no one outside the Navajo Nation. The language structure differed fundamentally from Indo-European languages that Japanese cryptographers understood, making linguistic analysis nearly impossible even if they'd had Navajo speakers available for consultation, which they didn't. The tonal qualities and verb conjugations created sounds that non-speakers couldn't distinguish or reproduce accurately, while the vocabulary lacked words for modern military equipment that would need to be invented specifically for code purposes. This combination of linguistic complexity and limited speaker population meant that even if Japanese captured codebooks or equipment, they couldn't use them without Navajo speakers, and recruiting Navajos to work for Japan was effectively impossible given the historical and cultural barriers involved. The code development began in 1942 when Philip Johnston, a World War I veteran who'd grown up on Navajo Reservation as son of missionaries, proposed using Navajo language for military communications. Marine Corps was skeptical initially, but agreed to demonstration where Navajo volunteers transmitted and received messages faster and more accurately than existing encryption systems, while producing communications that linguistic experts confirmed were essentially undecipherable without knowledge of both Navajo language and the specific military code overlay. The demonstration convinced Marine leadership to recruit Navajo volunteers for specialized communications training, creating a program that would eventually involve over 400 Marines whose contributions remained classified for nearly 3 decades after war's end.
The original 29 Navajo recruits who reported to training in 1942 faced the challenge of creating military vocabulary in a language that had no words for tanks, aircraft, ships, or modern weapons. They solved this through a brilliant system combining direct translation where possible with metaphorical substitution where necessary, creating code words that made sense to Navajo speakers while being incomprehensible to anyone else. Aircraft became birds with specific bird names denoting aircraft types, so fighter planes were hummingbirds while bombers were buzzards, creating logical associations that Navajo speakers could remember easily, while outsiders couldn't guess the meanings. Ships became fish, with different fish species representing different vessel types, while military ranks translated through Navajo clan and leadership terminology that conveyed hierarchical relationships in culturally appropriate ways. The alphabet encoding was equally clever, as code talkers needed to spell words that had no Navajo equivalents, requiring a system for transmitting English letters through Navajo words. They created lists where each letter corresponded to multiple Navajo words whose English translation started with that letter, so A could be transmitted as apple or ant or axe, depending on which Navajo word the sender chose, creating variation that prevented pattern analysis from revealing the underlying alphabet. This multiple encoding system meant the same English message could be transmitted dozens of different ways, depending on which alphabet words the sender selected, making cryptographic analysis effectively impossible because there was no consistent pattern to detect or exploit. The receiving code talker would hear the Navajo word translated to English to get the first letter and build the original message letter by letter through a process that was laborious but absolutely secure against decryption. The training was intensive as recruits had to memorize hundreds of code words, practice rapid transmission and reception until they could match or exceed encrypted machine speed, and maintain operational security that prevented anyone, including other Marines, from learning the code's details. The code talkers couldn't write anything down during operations because captured codebooks would compromise the entire system, forcing them to rely purely on memory for hundreds of vocabulary terms and encoding protocols. This created enormous mental demands during combat when stress and fatigue made concentration difficult, yet code talkers maintained remarkable accuracy because they understood that errors could cost American lives while breaches of security could render the entire code worthless. The psychological pressure was intense, but they managed it through training that built confidence and through cultural traditions that emphasized responsibility and service to community extended to their military units.
The combat deployment of code talkers began in Pacific Theater, where Marine operations required rapid tactical communications that conventional encryption couldn't provide fast enough for mobile warfare. Standard code machines required time to encrypt and decrypt messages, creating delays that could be fatal when situations changed faster than communications could adapt, while hand encryption was even slower and more prone to errors that compromised message accuracy. Code talkers eliminated these delays by transmitting directly in Navajo without needing mechanical encryption or decryption, allowing real-time communication that kept pace with combat operations while maintaining security that encrypted machines couldn't guarantee against determined cryptographic attack. This speed advantage was crucial during amphibious assaults, where coordination between units advancing at different rates required constant communication to prevent friendly fire incidents and exploitation of tactical opportunities. The first major combat test came at Guadalcanal, where code talkers demonstrated their value by maintaining communications during the chaotic fighting that characterized jungle warfare, where radio was often the only reliable contact between separated units. The terrain disrupted visual signaling, while the vegetation made wire laying impractical, forcing reliance on radio communications that were vulnerable to Japanese interception and jamming.
Code talkers solved this by providing secure communications that Japanese couldn't understand, even when they intercepted transmissions clearly, creating situations where Japanese knew Americans were coordinating movements but couldn't determine what those movements were or how to counter them effectively. This information asymmetry gave Marines enormous advantages by allowing coordination while preventing Japanese from anticipating American actions or concentrating forces to counter specific threats. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was significant as they realized American Marines were using communications they couldn't intercept effectively, creating uncertainty that degraded Japanese tactical planning. Japanese intelligence had successfully broken some American codes earlier in the war, giving them insights into Allied operations that proved valuable for defensive planning. The Navajo Code's resistance to all decryption efforts eliminated this intelligence source, forcing Japanese to rely on observation and captured documents rather than intercepted communications for information about American intentions. This created operational fog that Marines exploited through rapid maneuvers that Japanese couldn't anticipate or counter because they lacked the advance warning that successful code breaking would have provided. Iwo Jima represented the ultimate test of Code Talker capabilities during the most intense fighting of the Pacific War, where the volcanic island's strategic location made it crucial to both sides. The Japanese had fortified Iwo Jima for over a year, creating defensive positions designed to inflict maximum casualties on any invasion force, while the Americans needed the island's airfields to support B-29 bomber operations against Japan. The resulting battle created communications challenges unprecedented in the Pacific Campaign, as Marines needed to coordinate artillery, air support, armor, and infantry across difficult terrain against enemies who'd prepared every defensive position to maximize American casualties. Code talkers enabled this coordination by maintaining communications that worked when conventional systems failed, providing the real-time intelligence and fire support coordination that allowed Marines to overcome defenses that seemed impregnable. The 800 messages in 48 hours accomplishment occurred during the crucial first days of the Iwo Jima assault, when communications demands were at their peak and errors could have been catastrophic. The Marine transmitting this volume was working essentially non-stop except for brief rest periods, receiving tactical reports from frontline units and transmitting them to command posts that used the intelligence to coordinate supporting fires and reinforcements. Every message mattered because it contained information about Japanese positions, Marine casualties, ammunition status, or tactical situations that commanders needed to make informed decisions. The zero error rate was remarkable given the volume and speed required, demonstrating both the code talker's skill and the Navajo Code's inherent reliability that prevented the confusion that plagued other communication systems under similar operational stress. The 6 code talkers who participated in the flag raising on Mount Suribachi demonstrated how thoroughly they'd become integrated in Marine operations, serving as regular Marines who happened to provide specialized communication support rather than being segregated specialists who only handled radio duties. They fought as infantry when necessary, participated in assaults and defensive operations, shared the same dangers as every other Marine on Iwo Jima, while also bearing the additional burden of maintaining communications under combat conditions. This integration reflected Marine Corps culture that emphasized every Marine was a rifleman first, regardless of specialized skills, creating situations where code talkers might be transmitting tactical intelligence one moment and fighting off Japanese counterattacks the next, without transitioning between roles because both were part of their Marine duties. The tactical applications extended beyond just secure communications to include capabilities that conventional encryption couldn't match regardless of security. Code talkers could relay complex tactical situations through descriptive language that conveyed nuances lost in standardized code formats, providing commanders with richer information that enabled better decisions. They could ask clarifying questions and receive immediate answers without the delays inherent in mechanical encryption, creating dialogues that resolved ambiguities before they became problems. They could adapt to unexpected situations by creating new terminology on the fly when circumstances required describing things not covered in standard codebooks, maintaining communication effectiveness even when facing unprecedented tactical situations. This flexibility was impossible with mechanical codes that required predefined formats and couldn't accommodate innovation without compromising security. The Japanese frustration with Navajo code was documented in captured intelligence reports that acknowledged American Marines were using communications that resisted all decryption efforts despite extensive resources devoted to cryptographic analysis. Japanese cryptographers were skilled and had broken American codes earlier in the war, giving them confidence they could break any encryption if given sufficient intercepts and time. The Navajo Code's resistance to their efforts was therefore particularly frustrating because it represented a failure they couldn't explain or overcome regardless of effort invested. They tried linguistic analysis by recording transmissions and having experts study the sounds, tried pattern analysis looking for repetitions that might reveal code structure, tried everything conventional cryptography offered without ever making progress toward understanding what they were hearing. This failure cost Japan valuable intelligence while boosting American confidence in communications security. The post-war classification of the Navajo Code created a unique burden for code talkers who returned from combat unable to discuss their service with family or community because the code remained classified for potential use in future conflicts. Imagine serving in combat, contributing to victory in ways your commanders praised as essential, then being forbidden from telling anyone what you'd actually done because the military wanted to keep the capability available if needed. Code talkers couldn't explain their wartime service to families who wondered what they'd done, couldn't share their experiences with veterans who'd understand the combat stress, couldn't receive recognition they'd earned because acknowledging their contributions would reveal classified information. This silence lasted until 1968 when the code was finally declassified, allowing code talkers to speak publicly about their service for the first time in over 2 decades after the war ended. The psychological toll of this enforced silence was significant, as code talkers dealt with combat trauma without being able to discuss the specific circumstances that created that trauma. Post-traumatic stress affects many combat veterans, regardless of whether they can talk about their service, but being forbidden from discussing what happened makes treatment more difficult because therapeutic approaches often rely on being able to process traumatic experiences through discussion. Code talkers who struggled with combat memories were told they couldn't reveal details even to therapists or counselors, creating barriers to effective treatment while the memories remained as vivid and disturbing as any combat veteran's recollections. Some coped through traditional Navajo healing ceremonies,
that didn't require revealing classified details, while others struggled in isolation until declassification finally allowed them to share their experiences. The recognition, when it finally came, was meaningful, but also bittersweet, because many code talkers had died by the time declassification allowed public acknowledgement of their contributions. The original 29 who developed the code were elderly men by 1968, with some having passed away without ever receiving public recognition for service that commanders had called essential to victory. Those who survived to see declassification appreciated finally being able to discuss their wartime experiences, but regretted that comrades who'd shared the burden couldn't share the recognition. President Reagan honored the Code Talkers in 1982. Congress passed legislation in 2000 awarding congressional gold medals to the original 29, with silver medals to the others, and various states and organizations created memorials and recognition programs that attempted to make up for decades of official silence.
The broader impact of Code Talker service extended beyond their specific communications contributions to demonstrate Native American loyalty and capability when both were questioned by mainstream American society. Navajo people had faced discrimination and forced assimilation through federal policies that tried to eliminate their language and culture, with children punished for speaking Navajo in government schools that attempted to erase tribal identity. Then World War II created situations where the same language authorities had tried to suppress became crucial to American victory, with Navajo Marines using their traditional language to create unbreakable codes that protected American lives. This irony wasn't lost on Navajo communities who'd been told their language was worthless, now seeing it valued as a military asset that conventional encryption couldn't match. The Code Talker legacy became point of pride that demonstrated Navajo cultural preservation had value beyond just maintaining traditions for their own sake. The linguistic lessons influenced post-war military communications by demonstrating that languages without widespread international knowledge could provide security advantages that mechanical encryption couldn't guarantee. The military explored using other Native American languages for communication security, though never matched the Navajo program's scale or success because the combination of linguistic complexity, limited speaker population, and successful code development proved difficult to replicate with other languages. Modern military communications rely primarily on electronic encryption that's far more sophisticated than World War II systems, but the Navajo Code's success showed that linguistic security remains viable when circumstances allow its application. This lesson influenced how military planners thought about communications security in scenarios where electronic systems might be compromised or unavailable. The cultural impact within Navajo Nation was profound, as Code Talker's service became central to community identity and pride in ways that transcended the individuals who'd served. Young Navajo people learned about Code Talkers as heroes who'd used traditional language to defend America while demonstrating Navajo capability and loyalty in ways that challenged stereotypes and discrimination. The Code Talker story became an educational tool used to teach Navajo language to younger generations by showing its practical value in historical context, making language preservation efforts more appealing to youth who might otherwise have abandoned traditional language for English. The legacy also created political capital that Navajo leadership used to advocate for tribal interests by pointing to Code Talker contributions as evidence of Navajo loyalty and the value of supporting tribal sovereignty and cultural preservation.
The technical details of the code that emerged after declassification showed the ingenuity of the original 29 Code Talkers who'd created a system that was both secure and practical for combat use. The dual encoding system, using direct translation for military terms plus alphabet spelling for everything else, created flexibility that allowed communication of any message while maintaining security through linguistic complexity. The use of multiple words for each alphabet letter prevented pattern analysis that might have revealed the encoding system, even if Japanese had understood the underlying Navajo language. The memorization requirements were enormous, but the code talkers managed them through training and practice that built automaticity in encoding and decoding, allowing them to work at speeds that matched or exceeded mechanical encryption while maintaining accuracy that mechanical systems couldn't guarantee under field conditions. The integration with standard military procedures was seamless once commanders understood code talker capabilities and limitations, with communications officers learning to use code talkers for time-sensitive tactical transmissions while relying on conventional encryption for administrative traffic that didn't require immediate transmission. This division of labor played to each system's strengths by using code talkers when speed and reliability mattered most, while using machines for routine communications where encryption time wasn't critical. The result was communications architecture that provided both security and speed by selecting the appropriate method for each message type, rather than forcing all communications through single system regardless of suitability. This flexible approach maximized code talker contributions while acknowledging they couldn't handle all communications demands given their limited numbers and the mental demands of constant encoding and decoding. If stories like the Code Talkers matter to you, if remembering how language became a weapon matters, if recognizing Native American contributions to American victory matters, subscribe to the Foxhole Chronicles. We tell forgotten stories every week about heroes whose contributions were classified for decades, about cultural preservation that proved militarily valuable, about loyalty demonstrated through service when that loyalty was questioned by the society they defended. The Code Talkers deserve recognition they were denied for too long, and we're here to ensure their story reaches audiences who need to understand what they accomplished. Subscribe and stay with us through all the stories still waiting to be told. This is the story of how Navajo language became America's secret weapon, how 421 Marines created unbreakable code that Japanese cryptographers never solved despite desperate efforts, how one code talker transmitted 800 messages in 48 hours without single error during the Battle of Iwo Jima. This is about Major Howard Connor's acknowledgement that Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima without Navajo communications, about the original 29 who developed the code that would protect American lives, about the decades of silence when code talkers couldn't discuss their service because the code remained classified. This is about recognition that came too late for some, but meant everything to those who survived to receive it, about cultural redemption when language that had been suppressed became militarily essential, about loyalty demonstrated through service even when that loyalty was questioned. The legacy continues in modern military communications that learned from Code Talker success about the value of linguistic security and the importance of cultural assets in military operations. Contemporary forces use Native American languages for certain communications when appropriate, maintaining traditions the Code Talkers pioneered while adapting them to modern technological and operational contexts. The broader lesson about leveraging unique cultural resources for military advantage influenced how planners think about unconventional approaches to common problems, showing that sometimes the best solutions come from unexpected sources that conventional thinking would never consider. The Code Talker example demonstrated this principle conclusively by showing that ancient language could outperform modern encryption machines when applied creatively to military communications challenges. The individual stories of code talkers who served showed the human dimensions of this collective achievement, with men like Chester Nez, who was among the original 29, describing the pride he felt using Navajo language for military purposes after being punished for speaking it in school. His memoir and those of other code talkers revealed the psychological complexity of serving in military that represented a government whose policies had tried to destroy their culture, yet choosing to serve anyway because they loved their country despite its flaws. This complexity reflects broader Native American experiences with American society, where discrimination and injustice coexisted with opportunities and patriotism in ways that outsiders often failed to understand. The Code Talkers navigated these contradictions through service that demonstrated their loyalty while maintaining their cultural identity through the very language they used to protect American lives.
This is the final truth about the Navajo Code Talkers who created an unbreakable encryption system through their language and served in combat while maintaining communications that enabled American victory in the Pacific. Their contribution was essential as commanders acknowledged with Major Connor's statement that Iwo Jima would have been impossible without them, representing recognition from military leadership that understood what Code Talker communications had accomplished. The 800 messages in 48 hours with 0 errors represented human capability operating at peak performance under extreme stress, demonstrating both individual excellence and the code's inherent reliability that prevented errors even when speed and volume pushed human limits. The decades of classification that followed created unique burdens for men who'd served but couldn't discuss their service, forcing silence that was finally broken when declassification allowed code talkers to share their experiences with families and communities who'd wondered about their wartime service. The recognition that eventually came was meaningful but insufficient for what they'd contributed and what they'd endured through forced silence about their service. Congressional gold medals and presidential honors acknowledged their contributions officially, while memorials and educational programs spread their story to audiences who needed to understand what the Code Talkers had accomplished. But many had died before receiving recognition, taking their stories to graves while the code remained classified and their contributions stayed secret. Those who survived to see declassification and recognition appreciated finally being able to discuss their service, though they regretted that comrades couldn't share the honor. The complexity of their experience reflected broader Native American relationships with American society, where service and sacrifice coexisted with discrimination and historical injustices that weren't resolved through military service, but were complicated by it. The cultural impact within Navajo Nation transformed the Code Talker legacy into foundation for language preservation and cultural pride that extended far beyond the individuals who'd served. Navajo youth learned about Code Talkers as heroes who'd used traditional language to defend America, making language learning more appealing by demonstrating its practical value in historical context. The irony that language suppressed through federal assimilation policies became militarily essential wasn't lost on anyone. creating powerful narratives about cultural value that challenged historical and contemporary discrimination. The Code Talker story became a political tool that Navajo leadership used to advocate for tribal sovereignty and cultural preservation by pointing to their contributions as evidence of loyalty and capability that mainstream society often failed to recognize or respect. The modern recognition includes memorials, museums, educational programs, and ongoing efforts to ensure Code Talker contributions aren't forgotten as the last survivors pass away. The Code Talker story appears in school curricula, military training programs, and popular culture in ways that spread awareness of their contributions to audiences who might never have learned about them otherwise. This recognition matters because it corrects historical oversights that left Code Talker contributions minimized or ignored in mainstream World War II narratives that focused on conventional military operations while overlooking specialized programs that enabled those operations. The Code Talkers deserve placement in historical narratives alongside other crucial contributors to Allied victory, recognized for creating communications security that protected American lives and enabled tactical coordination that conventional encryption couldn't match.
This is how the Navajo language became a weapon that Japanese couldn't counter. How 421 Marines served in combat while providing communications that commanders called essential to victory. This is 800 messages in 48 hours without single error, demonstrating capability that mechanical encryption couldn't match, while maintaining security that Japanese cryptographers never broke. This is the original 29 who developed the code in 1942, expanding to over 400 by war's end, while maintaining perfect operational security that kept the code unbreakable throughout the conflict. This is decades of silence when code talkers couldn't discuss their service, followed by recognition that came too late for some, but meant everything to those who survived to receive it. This is cultural redemption when suppressed language proved militarily essential, demonstrating value that federal policies had failed to recognize through decades of forced assimilation. This is the Code Talker legacy that continues in modern military communications, in Navajo language preservation, in recognition that honors service while acknowledging the complexity of Native American relationships with the society they defended.